You're a dropout, Genevieve. You'll be lucky to find work as a janitor. You're just not smart enough for this family. My mother said that to me on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were when she hosted her book club. 12 women in Chanel jackets, drinking Sancerre and pretending they'd read the book. She said it in front of all of them, her voice cutting through the room like a shard of glass. She didn't even lower her voice. My name is Genevieve Ashford. I'm 30 years old, and 6 years after my mother told me I'd amount to nothing more than a cautionary tale, I sat in my corner office on the 31st floor of a building I own, not lease, own, in downtown San Francisco. Through my floor-to-ceiling windows, I watched the fog crawl over the Golden Gate Bridge, gray and heavy. On my dashboard, a new name appeared. Margot Ashford, 61 years old, applying for a senior operations role at my company, Ashford Nexus, the same company she told me would fail before I finished my first line of code. She listed her credentials, a bachelor's from Wellesley, an MBA from Columbia, and then the line that made my skin crawl. Under the section asking why she wanted the job, she wrote, "I believe my traditional expertise would bring much-needed structure to a young organization." Much-needed structure? She didn't know the difference between a Kubernetes cluster and a Docker container. My team was managing microservices with sub-10 millisecond latency, and she wanted to organize a world she didn't even have the vocabulary to describe. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass, grounding myself. I could smell the sharp aroma of the espresso machine and hear the rhythmic, quiet tap of keyboards from the DevOps floor below. She didn't know it was my company. I'd kept my face out of the press for years. I built Ashford Nexus in the dark, the same way I learned to survive, quietly, in the rooms where nobody expected me to be. But now, the woman who called me a janitor was at my door, begging for a seat at my table. Everything I'd buried for 6 years, every cold dinner, every look of pure disappointment, it all surfaced in the time it took to click Review Application. This isn't the fairy tale version of success. This is the real one. Before I go on, if this story resonates with you, please take a moment to like and subscribe. I'd love to know where you're watching from, and what time are you over there? The Ashfords don't fail. That was the first rule I learned, before I could even spell my own name. My mother had it practically engraved into the walls of our brownstone on East 72nd Street. 4 floors, pre-war molding, a kitchen that smelled like lemon polish and dried lavender because Margot Ashford didn't cook, she curated. Everything in that house existed to project a specific image. The books on the shelves were arranged by spine color. The piano in the sitting room was tuned monthly, even though nobody played it anymore. And her 3 children were expected to perform the same function as the furniture. Look right, sound right, be right. My older brother, Trent, was the golden one. First word at 9 months, reading by 3. He got into Dalton, then Exeter, then Harvard pre-med without breaking a sweat. Or at least that's how my mother told it. She'd bring him up at dinner parties like a resume she was proud of. Trent just finished his surgical rotation at Mass General. Trent's attending recommended him for the fellowship. She'd say his name, and her whole face would change, softer, warmer, like someone had turned on a light behind her eyes. Then there was Colette. Colette was the strategic one. She did law. Columbia, like our mother. Law review. Clerked for a federal judge before she turned 27. Colette had this way of walking into a room and making everyone feel slightly underdressed. She got that from our mother. They shared clothes, shared opinions, shared a specific way of looking at me like I was a stain on something expensive. And then there was me. Genevieve, the youngest. The one who couldn't sit still during Latin tutoring. The one who got a C in AP chemistry. Not because I didn't understand the material, but because I turned in a project about algorithmic modeling of molecular reactions instead of the assigned lab report. My teacher called it creative but misguided. My mother called it embarrassing. I want to be specific about something. She didn't hit me. She didn't scream. Margot Ashford was far too refined for that. What she did was worse in some ways. She simply acted as though I wasn't quite finished, like God had started making an Ashford and gotten distracted halfway through. She'd look at my report cards and sigh, not angry, disappointed, which, if you've ever been a kid desperate for approval, you know is the thing that actually kills you. I was 14 when I found Arthur Cregan, or rather, he found me. Arthur lived 3 blocks from us in a narrow townhouse that looked like it was slowly being eaten by ivy. He was 71, retired, former systems architect for Bell Labs in the 70s and early 80s, back when computing was still a craft, not an industry. He had this workshop in his basement, soldering stations, oscilloscopes, 3 monitors running simultaneously, all displaying different terminal windows. The place smelled like burnt solder and old coffee and that particular metallic tang that electronics give off when they've been running too long. I met him because his Wi-Fi network had an unusual name, Ashford_signal weak, which I took personally. I knocked on his door to ask if he was mocking us. He laughed so hard he started coughing. "Kid," he said, wiping his eyes, "I named that because your family's router broadcasts on a congested channel. You're bleeding signal interference into my spectrum analyzer." I didn't know what half those words meant, but I wanted to. Arthur didn't teach like school taught. There were no syllabi, no grades, no gold stars. He'd hand me a broken circuit board and say, "Tell me what's wrong with it." And I'd sit there for 3 hours, tracing pathways with a magnifying glass until I found the cold solder joint or the burned-out capacitor. Then he'd hand me another one. By 15, I could build a basic TCP/IP network from scratch. By 16, I was writing Python scripts to automate his home security system. By 17, I understood enough about cloud infrastructure and distributed computing to know that what they were teaching me at school was already 10 years behind. But at home, none of that existed. I'd come back from Arthur's workshop with solder burns on my fingers, and my mother would glance at them the way you'd look at a stain on a tablecloth. She never asked where I'd been. I think she assumed I was wasting time, the way she assumed everything I did was a lesser version of what Trent or Colette were accomplishing. The dinner table was the worst. Every Sunday, Margot hosted what she called family reviews. Trent would talk about his cases, Colette would discuss her clerkship, and I'd sit there, pushing roasted carrots around my plate, waiting for the question that never came in the right shape. "And Genevieve, what did you do this week?" It wasn't curiosity, it was an audit. I built a local server to test latency protocols for, in English, please. I'm learning how the internet actually works, the infrastructure layer, how data moves between. She's playing with computers again. That was Colette. Not cruel, exactly, just dismissive. The way you talk about a dog that keeps fetching the wrong stick. My mother would nod, a tiny nod, the kind that closed a door without making a sound. I was 18 when the door closed for real. I'd been accepted to NYU, not the program my mother wanted. She wanted Stern, the business school. I'd applied to Tandon, the engineering school, without telling her. When the acceptance letter came, I made the mistake of being excited about it at breakfast. I still remember the smell of the fresh-cut grapefruit on her plate, the sound of her butter knife against toast, that precise scraping. "Engineering," she said, like the word was something she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. "Computer science, specifically. They have a..." Your brother is at Harvard Medical School, your sister clerked for Judge Avery, and you want to go to engineering school. She put down her knife, looked at me, and said the thing I carried for years like a stone in my chest. I suppose every family needs its disappointment. I went to Tandon, lasted 3 semesters. Not because I couldn't handle the coursework. I was ahead of most of my professors on distributed systems and API endpoint architecture, but the pace was wrong. They were teaching theory for problems I was already solving in practice. Arthur had given me the real education. NYU was just giving me the vocabulary for what I already knew. So I dropped out. And that's when my mother stopped pretending I was still in Ashford. The phone call lasted 4 minutes. I know, because I stared at the timer on my screen the entire time, watching the seconds climb while my mother dismantled me with the efficiency of someone canceling a subscription. You dropped out. You dropped out. She didn't yell. Margot Ashford's voice actually got quieter when she was furious, like a blade being sharpened. The quieter she got, the deeper the cut. Trent never dropped out. Colette never dropped out. I never dropped out. Your father, God rest him, graduated top of his class at Columbia Law and practiced for 34 years without a single blemish on his record. And you couldn't even finish a program that was already beneath this family. I was standing in my dorm room. Half-packed boxes everywhere, a poster of Ada Lovelace taped to the wall that I'd bought at a street fair in the village. My roommate's side was already empty. She'd gone home for winter break. The room smelled like cardboard, and the radiator was clanking that uneven rhythm old New York buildings have, like a mechanical heartbeat that can't find its tempo. Mom, I'm not quitting, I'm redirecting. There's a difference. The things I'm working on... What things? What are you working on, Genevieve? What do you have? No degree, no prospects, no plan that any rational person would recognize as a plan. I have skills that you have a hobby, and I will not fund a hobby. That was the real sentence, the one underneath all the others. Margot wasn't just disappointed, she was pulling the money. Tuition, the apartment deposit she'd co-signed, the monthly allowance that I'd barely touched anyway because I spent most of my time in Arthur's basement or the university lab. All of it gone. If you want to throw your life away, you'll do it without the Ashford name attached. You can't take my name. I can take everything else. She hung up. 4 minutes and 11 seconds. I stood there holding the phone against my ear for another 30 seconds, listening to dead air, because some part of me thought she'd call back. She didn't. Colette texted me an hour later, not to check on me, to inform me. Mom changed the locks on the brownstone. Your things are in storage on Lex. Keys at the front desk. Don't make a scene about it. Don't make a scene. 13 words. That was my sister's entire contribution to the worst day of my life. Trent didn't reach out at all. Not that day, not that week, not for 2 years after. I found out later that my mother had framed it as an intervention. She told them I was spiraling and that cutting off resources was the responsible thing to do. She made my exile sound like medicine, bitter but necessary. I had $940 in my checking account, a laptop that Arthur had helped me build from salvaged parts, an ugly thing, thick as a dictionary, with a fan that sounded like a leaf blower, and a duffel bag with enough clothes for a week. I found a room in Bushwick. Not an apartment, a room in a railroad flat shared with 3 other people. A line cook named Marco, who worked nights and slept days, a nursing student named Priya, who was never home, and a guy named Dale, who I think was selling something out of his bedroom, but I never asked because the rent was $400 a month, and I couldn't afford questions. My room was the size of a parking space. The window faced a brick wall. The mattress sat directly on the floor because there was no frame, and the floor itself had this sticky quality that no amount of mopping could fix. At night, I could hear the J train rumbling past, and the walls would vibrate just slightly, just enough to remind me that everything around me was temporary and thin. I set up my workstation on a folding table I found on the sidewalk on DeKalb Avenue. Laptop, external monitor I bought for $40 from a pawn shop on Myrtle, a surge protector. That was my office. That was my entire company, if you could even call it that. Because that's what I decided. Somewhere between my mother's phone call and my first night in Bushwick, lying on that floor-bound mattress staring at a water stain shaped like Florida, I made a decision that didn't feel brave at the time. It felt like the only option left. I was going to build something. Not to prove her wrong, that came later, but because building things was the only language I spoke fluently. Code didn't judge me. Servers didn't sigh at the dinner table. A well-written function either worked or it didn't. And if it didn't, the error message told you exactly why. No subtext, no silence, just logic. Arthur helped. He couldn't give me money. He was living on a fixed pension and Social Security. But he gave me something more important. Access. His old contacts at Bell Labs had scattered into the private sector, and some of them had landed at places that mattered. He made 3 phone calls and got me a freelance contract doing back-end security audits for a small fintech firm in Jersey City. The pay was terrible, $1,400 a month for work that should have billed at triple that rate. But it was real work. Real problems, production servers with real vulnerabilities that I patched at 2 in the morning while drinking instant coffee that tasted like hot dust. I lived on rice and eggs, not as a metaphor, literally rice and eggs 5 days a week. On Fridays, I'd let myself buy a bodega sandwich, turkey and Swiss on a roll, yellow mustard, $3.50. I ate it slowly because it was the only meal all week that felt like a choice rather than a calculation. Priya noticed. She was quiet about it, but she'd sometimes leave a container of dal in the fridge with a sticky note that said, "Too much, help yourself." I never thanked her properly. I should have. When you're that broke and that proud, kindness feels like a mirror you don't want to look into. 6 months in, I landed a second contract, then a third. Word spread the way it does in technical circles, not through marketing or LinkedIn posts, but through whispered recommendations between engineers. There's this girl in Brooklyn. She found a 0-day vulnerability in our authentication layer that 3 senior devs missed. She charges nothing. Hire her before she figures out what she's worth. I didn't figure out what I was worth for a long time, but I figured out what I could build. The idea for Ashford Nexus came at 3 in the morning on a Sunday in August. The heat in Bushwick was suffocating. My window unit had died 2 weeks earlier, and I couldn't afford a replacement. I was sitting in my underwear at the folding table, debugging a firewall configuration for a client, and I noticed a pattern in their network traffic that I'd seen in 3 other clients' systems that month. The same vulnerability, the same blind spot. Different companies, different industries, same fundamental architecture flaw. They were all using legacy security protocols bolted onto modern cloud infrastructure. It was like putting a screen door on a submarine. And I realized, sitting there in the heat, sweat dripping onto my keyboard, that nobody was building the bridge between old systems and new ones. Not properly, not from the ground up. I opened a new file, named it Nexus V1, and started writing the first lines of code for a platform that would eventually process over 2 billion secure transactions a year. But I didn't know that yet. All I knew was the room was hot and the code made sense, and nobody in my family had called me in 7 months. The first version of the platform was garbage. I need to say that because people hear tech founder and imagine some cinematic montage, fingers flying across keyboards, green code scrolling on black screens, a moment where the protagonist leans back and whispers, "It works." That's not what happened. What happened was 9 months of failure that looked like failure and felt like failure because it was failure. Nexus V1 crashed constantly. The encryption handshake protocol I designed had a memory leak that would eat through server resources in about 40 minutes. Every time I thought I'd fixed it, a new edge case would surface. Some obscure interaction between the legacy system bridge and the modern API gateway that I hadn't accounted for. I'd patch one hole and 3 more would open. It was like trying to hold water in a net. Arthur came to Bushwick twice a week. He'd take the subway from the Upper East Side, a 71-year-old man on the J train with a leather satchel full of engineering notebooks from 1978, and he'd sit next to me at the folding table and read my code line by line. He never said, "Good job." Arthur didn't operate in compliments. He'd point at a function and say, "What happens when this receives a null input at scale?" And I'd stare at it and realize I hadn't thought about that. Then I'd rewrite it. He taught me something during those months that no university ever could have. He called it architectural honesty. The idea that every system, every network, every platform, every piece of infrastructure has a truth buried inside it, a core logic. And if you build outward from that truth, the system holds. But if you start decorating before the foundation is solid, you're building a lie, and lies collapse. "Your mother builds lies," he said one evening, casually, like he was commenting on the weather. He was eating a granola bar and reading my latest iteration of the encryption module. I looked up. What? Her world, the brownstone, the name, the dinner parties, it's all decoration on a weak foundation. She knows it. That's why she's so frightened of anything that doesn't match the pattern. I didn't respond. I wasn't ready to think about my mother as frightened. Frightening, sure, but frightened? That required a kind of empathy I hadn't earned yet. By month 11, something shifted. The memory leak stopped, not because I fixed it directly, but because I'd rebuilt the entire encryption handshake from scratch using a different approach, elliptic curve cryptography, layered over a custom key exchange protocol that reduced the computational load by 60%. It was elegant in the way that only engineers appreciate. Nobody would ever see it, nobody would ever know it existed, but underneath every transaction that Nexus would eventually process, that invisible architecture would be doing the work. I tested it on a Tuesday night, ran a simulated load of 10,000 concurrent connections through the platform, watched the resource monitor. Memory stable, CPU usage flat, latency under 12 milliseconds. I ran it again at 50,000, same result. Again at 100,000. The system held. I sat there in the blue light of my monitor and I didn't celebrate. I just breathed. Because for the first time in almost a year, something I'd built didn't break. Now I needed money. Not the kind of money my mother had. Inherited, managed, preserved. I needed investment capital, venture money, the kind that comes with term sheets and equity negotiations and people in Patagonia vests asking about your total addressable market. I had no connections to that world. Arthur's contacts were engineers, not investors. My mother's network was old money Manhattan, people who invested in real estate and wine collections, not pre-revenue software startups. And I couldn't exactly walk into a Sand Hill Road office and say, "Hi, I'm a 20-year-old dropout from Bushwick with no degree, no co-founder, and no revenue, but I've built a cybersecurity bridge platform in my bedroom. Please, give me $2 million. Except that's almost exactly what I did. There was a startup competition in November. TechCrunch Disrupt had a smaller, less publicized sister event called Foundry, held in a converted warehouse in Long Island City. No glamour, folding chairs, bad acoustics, a panel of 4 investors who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. But the winner got a $25,000 grant and, more importantly, a 15-minute meeting with Renata Moss. Renata Moss ran Thornfield Ventures. She was one of maybe 6 women in New York running a serious seed stage fund, and she had a reputation for 2 things: finding companies everyone else ignored and being absolutely ruthless in due diligence. Engineers loved her because she actually read the technical documentation. Founders feared her because she'd find the flaw in your architecture before your own CTO did. I entered Foundry with a demo running on my rebuilt laptop and a pitch deck I'd made in Google Slides because I couldn't afford Keynote. 14 slides, no animations, no stock photos of diverse teams high-fiving, just the problem, the solution, the architecture diagram, and a live demo. There were 32 companies competing. Most of them had teams, offices, logos, matching t-shirts. I showed up in jeans and a hoodie that had a small burn hole near the left cuff from a soldering accident. I looked like someone who'd wandered in from the street. One of the other founders, a guy in a fitted blazer with a company called Synapse AI, looked at me while I was setting up and said, "You here for the catering gig?" I didn't answer him. Not because I was being tough, because I genuinely didn't have the energy to care about his opinion. I'd been up since 4 a.m. running final stress tests on the demo, and my brain had room for exactly one thing: don't let the platform crash on stage. It didn't crash. I gave my pitch in 7 minutes, showed the live demo, a real-time simulation of a legacy banking system being integrated with a modern cloud security layer through Nexus with full end-to-end encryption and zero downtime during migration. The panel asked questions for 8 minutes. 3 of them were technical. I answered all of them. Renata Moss didn't ask a question during the Q&A. She just watched. She had this way of sitting, completely still, arms crossed, head tilted about 5 degrees to the left, that made you feel like you were being disassembled and cataloged. I won Foundry. The $25,000 went directly into server costs, AWS credits mostly, but the real prize came 3 days later when Renata's assistant emailed me a calendar invite. Miss Moss would like 15 minutes of your time. Thursday, 2 p.m., Thornfield offices, 41st and Madison. I took the train into Manhattan for that meeting wearing the only blazer I owned, a thrift store find that was slightly too big in the shoulders and smelled faintly of someone else's perfume. The Thornfield office was on the 22nd floor, glass and steel. The receptionist offered me sparkling water from a bottle that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. Renata kept me for 2 hours, not 15 minutes, 2 hours. She pulled up my architecture diagrams on her own screen and walked through every layer, asking questions that proved she understood distributed systems at a level most investors never bother with. She asked about my failover redundancy, my disaster recovery plan, my approach to horizontal scaling. She asked why I'd chosen elliptic curve over RSA for the encryption layer, and when I explained the computational efficiency argument, she nodded once, a single nod that felt like it weighed more than every compliment I'd never received from my mother combined. At the end, she leaned back and said 5 words. "How much do you need?" $750,000, seed round, for infrastructure, 1 full-stack developer, and 12 months of runway. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "I'll give you 1.2. You'll need the buffer. And hire 2 developers, not 1. You're going to burn out." I didn't cry, but I pressed my fingernails into my palms under that table so hard that they left marks that lasted 3 days. Walking out of that building onto Madison Avenue, I could smell roasted chestnuts from a street cart and exhaust from a passing bus, and something cold and clean underneath it all. November in Manhattan, that specific sharpness the air gets right before the first real freeze. I was 20 years old, I had $1.2 million in committed funding, and my mother didn't know I existed. The money hit my account on a Wednesday. $1.2 million sitting in a Chase business account registered to Ashford Nexus Technologies, LLC. I'd filed the paperwork myself. $32 for the LLC registration, $12 for the notary. I remember the woman at the notary office on Flatbush Avenue looking at the company name and saying, "Ashford, that's fancy. You fancy?" I wasn't fancy. I was terrified. Because here's what nobody tells you about getting funded. The money doesn't solve the fear. It replaces one fear with a bigger one. Before the investment, I was afraid of failing quietly. Now I was afraid of failing with someone else's money. Renata Moss hadn't given me charity. She'd given me a ticking clock, 12 months of runway. That meant I had exactly 1 year to turn a working prototype into a product that could generate revenue, or I'd be another cautionary tale in her portfolio. The dropout who had a clever idea but couldn't execute. I hired 2 developers within the first month, like Renata had insisted. The first was Dmitry Volkov, Russian-born, raised in Queens. He'd been a senior back-end engineer at a payments company that had gone under 6 months earlier. He was 43, balding, quiet, and he wrote the cleanest server-side code I'd ever read. Functions so precise they looked like math proofs. I found him through a post on a niche engineering forum where he'd written a detailed breakdown of microservice architecture patterns that made me stop scrolling and read it 3 times. The second was Keiko Tanaka, 26, Caltech dropout, which gave us something immediately in common. She'd left her program to work at a blockchain startup that turned out to be mostly vaporware, but her front-end work was extraordinary. She understood user interface not as decoration, but as communication. If the user has to think, she told me during her interview, you've already failed. I hired her on the spot. We worked out of a co-working space in Dumbo. Not one of the nice ones with the exposed brick and the kombucha on tap, the other kind. Fluorescent lights, carpet that smelled like old rain, a shared bathroom that required a key attached to a wooden spoon so nobody would steal it. We had 3 desks pushed together in a corner near the fire exit, and that was Ashford Nexus headquarters. Dmitry didn't ask about my family. Keiko didn't ask about my age. They cared about the code. That's it. For the first time in my life, I was in a room where the only thing that mattered was whether the work was good. Not my name, not my pedigree, not which school I'd attended or abandoned. Just, does this function execute? Does this system hold under pressure? Is this architecture sound? We built. That's the only word for it. 14-hour days, sometimes 16. Dmitry would arrive at 7 a.m. with a thermos of black tea so strong it looked like motor oil, and he wouldn't speak until noon. Keiko worked with headphones on, always. Some kind of ambient electronic music bleeding faintly out of the edges. I floated between them, reviewing code, testing integrations, handling the business side that neither of them wanted to touch. The business side. That was a crash course in a language I'd never learned at home. My mother understood money as a thing you inherited, preserved, and displayed. I was learning money as a thing you burned strategically. Burn rate, unit economics, customer acquisition costs, gross margin. I taught myself financial modeling from YouTube videos and a used copy of a textbook I bought for $6 from a street vendor on Broadway. The pages smelled like cigarette smoke, and someone had highlighted random passages in green marker that had nothing to do with the important parts. By month 4, we had a minimum viable product, Nexus V2. The platform could now integrate 3 major legacy security frameworks, COBOL-based banking infrastructure, older Fortran systems still running in insurance companies, and mainframe environments that hadn't been updated since the Clinton administration. Seamless, zero downtime migration, end-to-end encrypted data transfer through our proprietary bridge layer. Nobody cared. I sent cold emails to 47 companies, financial institutions, insurance firms, healthcare organizations, anyone running legacy systems alongside modern infrastructure, which was almost everyone because the dirty secret of corporate America is that half of it still runs on code written before I was born. Out of 47 emails, I got 3 responses. 2 were polite rejections. 1 was a request for more information from a mid-sized credit union in Connecticut called Harbor Line Federal. Their CTO was a man named Winston Greaves, 58, old school. He'd been running Harbor Line's IT infrastructure for 20 years, and he was drowning. Their board wanted cloud migration. Their regulators wanted stronger encryption. Their legacy systems were held together with patches and prayers. And he had a staff of 4 engineers, none of whom had experience with modern distributed architecture. I drove to Connecticut in a rental car that cost me $89 I couldn't really afford. Sat in Winston's office, a small room with a window overlooking a parking lot and a framed photo of his daughter's college graduation on the desk. He looked tired. Not executive tired, where you complain about it at cocktail parties. Actually tired. The kind where the bags under your eyes have their own shadows. He said, "I've been told we need to modernize. I've also been told it'll cost $3 million and take 18 months, and there's a 40% chance of catastrophic data loss during migration. So I've been not doing it." What if I told you we could do it in 6 weeks with 0 data loss and it would cost you a tenth of that? He stared at me, looked at the laptop I'd opened on his desk showing the Nexus dashboard, looked at me again. "I'd say you're either lying or you don't understand the problem." "I understand the problem. Your core banking platform runs on a modified COBOL framework from 1997. Your customer data sits on a DB2 database that hasn't been properly indexed in at least 5 years, and your current encryption is, no offense, barely compliant with last year's regulations, let alone next year's." Winston's face did something complicated. Part offended, part impressed, part terrified that a 20-year-old in a thrift store blazer had just described his entire infrastructure in 30 seconds. "How do you know all that?" "Because every company like yours has the same skeleton. I've studied it. That's what Nexus does. It sees the skeleton and builds around it instead of ripping it out." He gave us a pilot contract. $60,000, 6 weeks to prove the platform worked on a live production environment with real customer data and real regulatory oversight. I drove back to Brooklyn with the windows down, December air cutting through the car. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, but not from cold, from something I didn't have a name for yet. Later, I'd recognize it as the first tremor of momentum. We delivered the Harbor Line migration in 4 weeks and 3 days. 0 data loss, 0 downtime, full regulatory compliance. Winston called me on a Friday afternoon and said, "I don't know what you built, but it works, and I've already told 2 other credit unions about you." That's how it started. Not with a marketing campaign or a product launch or a press release, with one tired man in Connecticut telling 2 friends, who told 3 more, who told their industry contacts. The financial sector is small at the operational level. CTOs talk to each other the way neighbors talk over fences. And the fence conversation about Ashford Nexus spread faster than anything I could have manufactured. By month 9, we had 11 clients. By month 11, we had 26. The co-working space in Dumbo couldn't hold us anymore. I'd hired 4 more engineers and a part-time office manager named Sandra, who organized everything with a system of color-coded sticky notes that looked chaotic but was actually flawless. Renata called me on the last day of month 12, exactly 1 year from the initial investment. "Your numbers," she said. No hello. Renata didn't do pleasantries. $412,000 in annual recurring revenue, 26 active contracts, gross margin at 71%, 0 churn. Silence. Then, Series A. "I'm leading it. We'll talk terms next week." She hung up. That was her version of a standing ovation. That night, I sat in the Dumbo office alone. Everyone had gone home. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the carpet still smelled like old rain, and through the window I could see the Manhattan Bridge lit up against the dark water. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to my mother's contact. Her name just sat there on the screen. Margot Ashford. I hadn't called her in over a year. She hadn't called me, ever. My thumb hovered. Then I put the phone down. Not yet. Series A closed at $8.5 million. Thornfield led the round. 2 other firms joined, Black Pine Capital out of Boston and a smaller strategic fund called Ridgepoint that specialized in cybersecurity investments. The terms were fair. Renata made sure of that. She told me once, in her clipped way, Bad terms kill more companies than bad products. Don't let anyone take your house to rent you furniture. I owned 63% of Ashford Nexus after dilution. That matters. I'll explain why later. The first thing I did with the Series A money was get us a real office, 17th floor of a building on J Street in Dumbo. Not flashy, no ping pong tables, no nap pods, but real desks, real chairs, a server room with proper cooling that didn't rely on opening a window in January, and a conference room with a glass wall that looked out toward the East River, where I could watch the ferries cross back and forth while I thought through problems. The second thing I did was hire Nadine Calloway. Nadine became my COO. She was 39, former operations director at a defense contractor in Virginia. She'd left because, her words, I got tired of building things designed to destroy things. She was tall, direct, wore the same style of black blazer every single day like a uniform, and she had an operational mind that worked like a sorting algorithm. She could look at a messy process and immediately see where the waste was, where the bottleneck lived, where the system would break if you scaled it by 10. I needed Nadine because I was drowning, not in code, in everything else. Contracts, hiring, payroll, legal compliance, insurance, the mundane machinery of running an actual company. I could architect a distributed security platform in my sleep, but ask me to negotiate a commercial lease, and I'd stare at the document like it was written in a dead language. Nadine handled all of it. She built systems around me so I could stay in the work, and she did it without ego, which is rarer than people think. She never once said, "You need me." She just showed up and made everything run. By year 3, Ashford Nexus had 94 employees and over 200 active contracts across financial services, healthcare, insurance, and government. We'd expanded beyond the bridge platform into a full cybersecurity suite: threat detection, incident response automation, compliance monitoring. The core product was still the legacy to modern integration layer, but the ecosystem around it had grown into something I couldn't have imagined in that Bushwick bedroom. Revenue hit 31 million. Not profit, revenue, but the margins were strong, 74% gross. Renata called it a machine. Winston Greaves at Harborline called it the thing that saved my job. I called it the thing I did instead of sleeping. Because I wasn't sleeping. 3 hours a night, maybe 4. My body had adapted to exhaustion the way some people adapt to altitude. Not comfortably, but functionally. I'd work until 2 a.m., collapse on the couch in my apartment. I'd upgraded from Bushwick to a 1-bedroom in Cobble Hill that still felt too large for me, and wake at 5:30 with my mind already running through the day's problems before my eyes opened. Dimitri noticed first. He came into my office one morning, closed the door, and sat down without being invited. That was unusual. Dimitri respected boundaries the way he respected clean code, religiously. "You look terrible, Dimitri." "Thank you, Dimitri. I'm serious. When did you last eat a meal that wasn't from a vending machine?" I tried to remember. Couldn't. "Genevieve, the company is not your body. If your body stops, the company stops. This is not complicated logic." He left a container of his wife's borscht on my desk. It was still warm. I ate it with a plastic fork and cried a little, which I'm telling you because this story doesn't work if I pretend I was invincible. I wasn't. I was a 23-year-old running a $30 million company with no family, no partner, and no safety net, fueled by borscht and stubbornness, and something darker underneath. This relentless engine that kept whispering, "You have to prove it. You have to prove it. You have to prove it." Prove what? To whom? I knew the answer. I hated that I knew it. Around this time, the press found me. Not because I sought them out. I deliberately avoided publicity. No social media presence, no conference appearances, no founder profile pieces. I wanted Ashford Nexus to be known for its product, not its story. The college dropout builds tech company narrative was a cliche I refused to perform. But a reporter at Wired named Callum Firth wrote a piece about the cybersecurity industry's invisible middle. Companies that weren't flashy enough for headlines, but were quietly becoming essential infrastructure. Ashford Nexus was mentioned in 2 paragraphs. He described us as the most important cybersecurity company most people have never heard of. He reached out for an interview. I declined. He wrote about us anyway, using public contract data and client testimonials. That article got picked up, reshared, quoted, and suddenly the phone started ringing in a different way. Not just clients, acquirers, partnership offers, speaking invitations. A producer from a business podcast called and asked if I wanted to share my journey. I said no to everything. Nadine thought I was being stubborn. Maybe I was. But I knew that the moment my face attached to the company, the story would stop being about the technology and start being about me, the dropout, the young woman, the underdog. And I didn't want to be an underdog. I wanted to be an architect. Arthur died on a Thursday in March, 74 years old, stroke. His neighbor found him in the basement workshop, slumped over his bench with a soldering iron still warm in his hand. He died the way he lived, in the middle of building something. I got the call from his neighbor, a woman named Ruth who I'd met twice. She said, "I'm sorry, dear. He talked about you all the time. He was very proud." I hung up and sat in my office with the door closed for 2 hours. Didn't cry. Couldn't. The grief was too heavy for tears. It sat in my chest like concrete, pressing down on everything, making it hard to breathe. I kept thinking about his hands, how steady they were, how he'd hold a circuit board the way some people hold a newborn, carefully with full attention, how he never once told me I was smart. He just kept handing me harder problems, which was his way of saying the same thing without cheapening it with words. The funeral was small, 11 people. I was the youngest by 20 years. A former colleague from Bell Labs gave a short eulogy that was mostly technical anecdotes. Arthur would have preferred it that way. Afterward, Ruth handed me a cardboard box. "He left this for you, had your name on it. Been sitting on his workbench for months." Inside was a mahogany box, heavy. The wood was smooth and dark, worn soft at the edges from years of handling. I opened it and found a single notebook, leather-bound, filled with Arthur's handwriting, small, precise, slanting slightly to the right. Page after page of system architecture diagrams, network maps, security protocols. And on the last page, in handwriting that was shakier than the rest, written recently I could tell, a single line. The foundation was always sound. Now build the tower. A.K. I closed the box, pressed my palm flat against the mahogany lid, felt the grain of the wood under my fingers, and I made a decision. It was time to stop hiding. I stopped hiding on a Tuesday. Fitting, I suppose. Tuesdays had always been my mother's day. Now they were mine. The first thing I did was accept Callum Firth's interview request. He flew from San Francisco to New York the same week. We sat in the conference room on J Street, the one with the glass wall and the ferry view, and I talked for 3 hours. Not about my family, not about dropping out, about the technology, about legacy infrastructure, about the gap between old systems and new ones, and why nobody was building the bridge properly. Callum was smart enough to let me steer. He published the piece 6 weeks later in Wired's print edition. Full feature, 4 pages. The headline read, "The Architect of the Invisible." No photos of me. I'd insisted on that. The cover image was a visualization of Nexus's network architecture, a web of interconnected nodes that Keiko had designed for the piece. Beautiful in the way that systems are beautiful when they work. Callum respected the boundary. He mentioned my age and my background in passing, 2 sentences, and spent the rest of the article on the product, the clients, the engineering philosophy. That article changed the trajectory of the company, not because of what it said, but because of who read it. Within a month, we had inbound interest from 3 Fortune 500 companies, 2 major banks, a federal agency I can't name, and a healthcare conglomerate called Med Alliance that was running patient data on a mainframe architecture so outdated that their own engineers privately called it the museum. Med Alliance became our biggest contract, $14 million over 2 years, full infrastructure migration, compliance overhaul, custom security layer built on top of Nexus's core platform. It required hiring 23 additional engineers and opening a second office, this time in San Francisco, the 31st floor of a building on Market Street. I flew out for the lease signing and stood at the window looking at the bay, and I thought about that parking space bedroom in Bushwick, the sticky floor, the mattress without a frame. 4 years between those 2 windows, 4 years and a distance that couldn't be measured in miles. Nadine managed the expansion. Dimitri led the Med Alliance technical team. Keiko redesigned the entire client-facing dashboard for enterprise scale. And I, for the first time, stepped into the role I'd been avoiding, CEO. Not just founder, not just lead architect, the person whose name was on the door and whose decisions shaped everything downstream. I was 24. Ashford Nexus was valued at $93 million in a private secondary assessment. Revenue was on pace for $47 million. And I still ate lunch alone at my desk most days, because old habits are the last architecture you learn to rebuild. If you've ever been the person your family decided wasn't worth believing in, the one they measured against siblings and found lacking, the one whose name came last or not at all, I want you to comment the word "seen" below this video. Because what I'm about to tell you is the part of this story that broke me open in ways success never could. The Ashfords were falling apart. I didn't know this in real time. I'd cut myself off so completely that the family existed for me only as a dull ache behind my ribs, present but manageable, like a chronic injury you learn to work around. But the collapse had been building for years, and it followed a pattern I recognized, the same pattern I'd seen in every legacy system I'd ever migrated. Service-level functionality masking deep structural rot. Trent's medical career stalled. Not publicly, the Ashfords would never allow public failure, but quietly, in the ways that matter. He'd been passed over for a department head position at Mass General twice. His research funding dried up. He moved to a smaller hospital in New Jersey and stopped publishing. Colette told people he was refocusing. The truth, which I learned much later, was that Trent had been struggling with a dependency on prescription medication for 2 years. Nobody talked about it. Ashfords don't have problems. They have transitions. Colette's trajectory cracked next. She'd made partner at a white shoe firm in Midtown by 31, the youngest woman in the firm's history. My mother had thrown a dinner party to celebrate. But partnership meant billing targets, and billing targets meant hours, and hours meant that her marriage dissolved in 18 months. Her husband, a man named Gregory, whom I'd met exactly once at a holiday dinner, left a note on the kitchen counter and took the dog. Colette moved back into the brownstone, into her old bedroom at 33. And my mother, Margot. Her consulting firm, Sterling Ashford Associates, which she'd run for 20 years, was hemorrhaging clients. The firm specialized in organizational restructuring for financial institutions. Essentially, they told banks how to reorganize their departments and streamline operations. It was the kind of work that sounded important in 2005 and was almost entirely obsolete by 2020. Because everything her firm did manually, the audits, the reports, the recommendations, could now be done faster and cheaper by software, by platforms, by companies like mine. She didn't know that last part yet. The firm went from 19 employees to 7, then to 3. Revenue dropped by 70% in 2 fiscal years. Margot burned through savings to keep the office lease on Park Avenue because appearances mattered more than arithmetic. She refinanced the brownstone, then refinanced it again. The walls were still perfect. The books were still arranged by spine color. But the foundation, Arthur's word, was crumbling. I found out about all of this through Priya. Yes, Priya, my old roommate from Bushwick, the nursing student who left containers of dal in the fridge. She'd finished her degree, moved to Manhattan, and ended up working at the same hospital in New Jersey where Trent had landed. She recognized his last name, put it together, and she called me one evening in October, the first time we'd spoken in 3 years. "Genevieve, I don't know if this is my place, but your brother is here. He's not in a good way, and I looked up your family because I was worried, and things seem bad for all of them." I listened, didn't interrupt. She told me about Trent's situation, about the brownstone being leveraged, about Colette living at home, about the consulting firm bleeding out. "I'm not telling you what to do," Priya said. "I'm just telling you what I see." After she hung up, I sat in my San Francisco office. It was late. The city was doing that thing it does at night, fog rolling through the streets below like slow water, softening every edge. I could hear the hum of our server room through the wall, a constant low vibration, the sound of systems running exactly as they should. My family was a failing system, legacy architecture, no migration plan, and they didn't even know the person who could save them was the one they'd thrown away. 3 weeks later, my HR director, a woman named Simone, forwarded me a batch of applications for an open operations coordinator position in our New York office. Routine, mid-level role, nothing that would normally cross my desk. But Simone had flagged one application with a yellow sticky note, just 2 words in her careful handwriting. "You okay?" I opened the file, and there it was. Margot Ashford, 61, Wellesley, Columbia MBA, 30 years in strategic consulting, applying for a position 3 levels below what she'd consider acceptable in any other lifetime. And in the section that asked why she wanted to work at Ashford Nexus Technologies, she'd written her answer in the same precise, controlled language she used for everything. Language designed to project competence while hiding desperation. She didn't know. The company name was common enough. My face wasn't public. There was no reason for her to connect Ashford Nexus Technologies to the daughter she'd erased from her life 4 years ago. But I knew. And now I had to decide what to do with that. I closed the laptop, walked to the window, pressed my forehead against the cold glass. The bay was out there, gray and flat, and I stood there for a long time, holding a decision that felt heavier than the mahogany box Arthur had left me. I stared at that application for 3 days. Opened it, closed it, opened it again, looking for some clean logic, an if-then statement that would tell me exactly what to do. But this wasn't code. There was no error message pointing to the broken line, just a name on a screen and 6 years of silence pressing against the back of my teeth. On the 3rd night, I called Simone. The Ashford application. Schedule the interview. New York office, Thursday, 2 p.m., the small conference room. No glass walls. Simone paused. She'd known since she wrote those 2 words on the sticky note. "You want me to assign it to the hiring team, or I'll do it myself?" Quiet. Then, "Okay, Genevieve." I flew to New York on Wednesday, walked into the J Street office after hours, sat in the small conference room and placed Arthur's leather notebook on the table. Not to reference, just to hold close, the way you carry a photograph of someone you've lost, not because you'll forget their face, but because the object holds what your memory can't. Thursday, 2 p.m., 2 knocks. Precise. "Come in." She entered posture first, the way she entered every room. Blazer pressed, hair set, but the handbag was last season, scuffed at the corner, and she hesitated at the threshold, 1/2 second of uncertainty the old Margot would never have allowed. That 1/2 second told me more than her resume. "Margot Ashford, thank you for the opportunity to..." She stopped. Her eyes moved across my face, scanning, catching, then the lock. "Genevieve." "Sit down, Margot." She sat, hands to her lap. I watched her reach for the composure, that old architecture, but the structure was thinner now. I could see daylight through it. "This is yours, all of this." 5 years now. Silence. Not the weaponized kind from the dinner table. A different silence, the kind that happens when someone's framework collapses and they have to sit inside the undecorated truth of a moment. "Why did you apply here?" I asked. She started performing operational alignment, strategic value, the controlled language from her application, competence as camouflage. "Margot, why?" The performance fell in layers, the vocabulary first, then the posture, then something behind her eyes, a wall lowering not by choice, but by exhaustion. "Because I need the work, Genevieve." I opened Arthur's notebook, ran my thumb across the paper. "A man named Arthur Cregan taught me something you never did. He said every system has a core truth. Build from that truth and it holds. Decorate over a weak foundation and it collapses." I closed the notebook. "You built this family like a showroom. When one piece didn't fit the display, you removed it. And you made Trent and Colette believe that perfection was the only currency your love accepted. Look what it cost all of them." Her eyes were wet. She didn't wipe them. I had never, not once in 24 years, seen Margot Ashford allow something on her face she hadn't approved. "I'm not going to hire you. Not because you can't do the work, because this company is the one honest thing I built from the wreckage of your approval. I won't make it another room where I perform for you." I stood. "But I'm not you either. Trent is getting help. I arranged it through someone who cared enough to call me when this family couldn't. Colette has my number whenever she's ready." I walked to the door, stopped, turned back. "Your children were never furniture, Margot. We were people." She looked up at me, and her mouth opened just slightly, then closed. No words came, but her hand moved to the edge of the table and gripped it, knuckles whitening. It was small, almost nothing, but it was the first honest thing I'd ever seen her body say. I left her in that room. I flew back to San Francisco that night, took a car from the airport straight to the office, 31st floor. The building was empty. I sat in my chair, the same chair from the hook of this story, the same window, the same fog crawling over the Golden Gate, and I set Arthur's notebook on the desk, open to the last page. The foundation was always sound. Now, build the tower. I read it twice, then I closed the notebook, leaned back, and for the first time in 6 years, I wasn't proving anything. Not to Margot, not to Arthur's memory, not to the ghost of a girl on a floor-bound mattress in Bushwick, staring at a water stain shaped like Florida. I was just sitting in a room I'd built, in a life I'd built, breathing. The fog moved, the city hummed, and I was enough. To every parent listening, your children are not mirrors. They are not monuments to your ambition or corrections for your regrets. They are architects of lives you may never fully understand, and that is not defect, that is the design. Let them build, even when the blueprints look nothing like yours, especially then. Because the greatest thing you can give your child isn't direction, it's trust. And the cruelest thing you can take from them isn't opportunity, it's belief.